They've clicked the YouTube button. In a moment, I'll start the show. I have a high-powered guest today. I'm impressed. I'm impressed with myself for having this guest. Let's do the show. Got the right stuff here? Yeah, I think I do. From the studio in the bonus room above the garage on the north side of Cary, at the foot of Mount Belzoni, this is the Triangle Talk Show. It is episode 55. It is going to be a politics episode because the word voter is right in the title. It's got to be a politics episode. March 29th, 2019, the League of Extraordinary Women Voters of Wake County. If you're watching the video, I'm glad I could use their logo because I can't fit all that in my type that I put on my titles, but well, that all fits there. The League of Extraordinary Women Voters of Wake County. I added the extraordinary. It's an old movie reference, you know, the old League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. It seemed appropriate. I've been dealing with some fairly new political entities on the show over the past year. Tuesdays with Tillis, well, that's only been going on for a couple of years. The Women's March is only a few years old. The Progressive Caucus of the Democratic Party, I've had a bunch of those folks on. I don't know how long they've been around. It could be quite a while. But, you know, they're a bunch of radicals, you know, more or less, bunch of rebels. The League of Women Voters has been around for a long time. They were formed in 1920, the year that women won the right to vote. Won? Maybe grabbed it. I don't know. 19th Amendment is what got them the right to vote. So it's going to be 100 years old next year. Big celebration. They got a lot of respect. They're in the news a lot. They had a case before the Supreme Court this week. And they were one of the groups that had a table at the Raleigh Women's March. And I went there. I was passing around my business card to all the groups that had tables there. And my card eventually filtered up to my guest today, and that is Diana Wynn. There, your title. And Diana is, well, tell you what, I don't need to introduce you. I have someone who can do an introduction. This is from the Women's March, where you spoke, and Ashley Popio did a great introduction, so I don't need to do that over again. Let's just listen to her.
So, next up, we've got Diana Wynn, who's a member of the Board of Directors for the League of Women Voters of Wake County. Yay! There she serves as the League's communication coordinator, co-chair of the redistricting committee, and she is also president-elect. I don't know about you, but I like a woman president. Woo! Diana previously served as the president of the ACLU of North Carolina. Please welcome Diana Wynn. Woo!
And Diana, I'm going to let you talk from
Good afternoon.
the talk here for a moment.
I am honored to be here today on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Wake County. The League is a nonpartisan organization dedicated to educating the public and engaging in advocacy on many important issues, including transparency in government.
I like this.
Voting rights, and I mean voting rights for everybody. Affordable housing. The environment. Fair voting maps. Fair elections here in North Carolina. And of course, women's rights, specifically the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment. Now today I've been asked to talk about redistricting and ending gerrymandering.
Okay, so you are clearly no shrinking violet.
Oh, well, thank you. I hope not.
And because I'm the guy that does the talking, but also pushes the buttons, I got to push a few buttons here. Welcome to the Triangle Talk Show.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
We were getting started here. I was being self-deprecating, about just being a little baby podcast, but not very many people watching. And you were very nice to say, well, you'll put out on social media, which is, going to reach, it's going to reach your audience, and everybody knows you already. So, and then hopefully they'll tell two friends, and they'll tell two friends.
Well, we are a grassroots organization. So what you're doing is very grassroots, and we certainly support that kind of activity.
Yeah. So, as Ashley said, you're the communications coordinator and president-elect. So you're going to become the actual president.
In May, we have our annual meeting, and I was designated president-elect last May, so I actually become president in May. So we elect our slate for the board of directors, and our board of directors is not an advisory board. We're a working board. We're an all-volunteer organization. That means that our board functions in many ways like the executive staff for the organization.
Okay. We'll get to a lot of the details in a moment. But I guess if you're going to be electing a slate in May, you will elect another president-elect, which means, unlike many organizations where you get somebody into their president position and you try to keep them there for life because it's hard to find, you'll have an escape route.
Well, we actually don't normally designate a president-elect. We did last year just to make the transition a little easier as I came up. But we cultivate leadership constantly within our committees and on our board. So I'm confident that when my term is up, somebody else who's well qualified will follow me. Right. We have lots of qualified members.
So I mentioned that there was a Supreme Court case on, I think it was Tuesday.
Yes.
That was about North Carolina's gerrymandering. And the two plaintiffs were Common Cause and the League of Women Voters. And I want to talk about that a lot in a minute. But why don't we first do that view from 30,000 feet about what the League of Women Voters is. So go ahead.
So the League of Women Voters, as you indicated earlier in the introduction, is an organization that's been around since 1920. And 1920 is when the 19th Amendment was passed, that I don't like to say gave women the right to vote, rather acknowledged women's right to vote. And it is not coincidental that the League was founded in 1920 because our predecessor organization was the National Women's Equality Association or Equal Suffrage Association. So the Equal Suffrage Association knew that once we had the right to vote, they didn't have a mission anymore. We would have won. And the goal would then be getting half the population who had been disenfranchised ready to vote. And teaching them about civics and citizenship and those kinds of things. But also from the very beginning, they determined that they would have a policy platform. So it wouldn't just be about encouraging people to vote, but that they would take positions on issues. And that was 99 years ago. And in many ways, our mission has remained unchanged, even though the issues have changed over time, and certainly women's involvement in elections and in politics has increased over time. So we're nonpartisan, and we were from the beginning, and we continue to be. What that means, though, and a lot of people are confused by it, what nonpartisan for us means is that we never, ever endorse or support, nor do we oppose a particular candidate for office or a particular party. However, we are not neutral on issues. So we're nonpartisan on elections, but we are not neutral on issues. On issues,
you took a stand on the constitutional amendments that
Absolutely. On several of them we did. So for the elections, we would never endorse nor oppose a candidate, but for issues that land on the ballot, we may choose from time to time to endorse or oppose specific issues. So, for example, in this last election, we opposed the photo voter ID requirement. On a couple of the other amendments, I think that we were silent on it, either because we simply didn't have a position or we had not had time to develop a position.
Yeah, the Marsy's Law and I think the hunting one.
You're right. Those are the two that we took no position. The National League has a pretty extensive document on what the positions are for the league, and unless we link a position to that requires then extensive research, so that when we take a position, we feel that we're well informed and can take that position. And we do that because we're not driven by any ideology, right? We're nonpartisan.
I looked across most of the issues and positions that you've taken, and well, I guess I'm not going to accuse you of ideology. There's, as you say, there's a position. You're not neutral, and I don't think I could find any that would be very far right of center.
No, and I think that is fair. I think that what you would find in looking at the history of the league is that from day one, it was a progressive policy platform. They were progressive women. They were both Democrats and Republicans who founded the league, but they were progressive in their thinking on policy. And the way
Democrats and Republicans have changed a lot since
they have. They've changed over time, and I would say they've changed over the last 3 or 4 years too, within the parties, and we're seeing continuing change, I think. But we arrive at our decisions based on what we feel is not good for a party, or but what is good for a community or for the American people and the electorate. And you know, if that is referred to as left or right, so be it. The facts are what they are. What many have said in recent years is that the league is sometimes accused of being a left-wing organization, but in fact, we consider ourselves moderate, and that while the league has stayed the same, the parties have become, they've moved more left and more right. So things have shifted around us. We've stayed pretty stable on our policy positions for many decades.
Anybody considering themselves centrist these days gets a lot of flack from both sides.
I agree, and I think that those who consider themselves moderate often will offer more explanation as to what that means. And
if you're explaining, you're losing. So.
Yeah, which is unfortunate, because I'm comfortable being functioning in a nonpartisan role, and personally, I'm an unaffiliated voter, and I choose to focus on the issues. And sometimes those issues are going to be supported by people on the left, and sometimes they're going to be supported by people on the right. Though again, you know,
can you give me any examples of the right? Any issues that
on the right, you know, I can't talk about official ones because sometimes we just simply it's about endorsing, and we choose not to endorse certain things. And
on a show like this, you're going to walk a bit of a tightrope.
We do.
You're representing the League of Women Voters. You're also Diana Wynne.
Right.
You can talk about your own opinions. You need to let the audience know which is which.
I absolutely. If I'm expressing my own opinion, I have to indicate that. But the League's positions are real clear, so I can't misspeak on the League. You know, what I would tell you is, for example, one of the things I like about the League is the League sees complexity in issues, and that we don't have a knee-jerk reaction in support of an issue just because a particular party supports the issue. So if someone is arguing for increases in fees or taxes, we're not necessarily going to support that until we take a real hard look at what that means. So, for example, we might be looking at, well, if we're increasing fees in one area, in a community, how does that affect other issues like affordable housing, for example, which is something we support. That sometimes we're recognizing you have to balance issues. And, and that may sound wishy-washy. I'd like to say that is a more moderate approach and a more well-reasoned approach to the issues and policy stances.
So can you think of anything that is more favored by the conservative side that the league has taken a position on that favored that as well?
Sure, but we have to go back a few years. So you mentioned redistricting. So currently...
Well, that's favored by whoever's out of power.
Right. And the league has been in favor of redistricting reform for many decades. So the official policy was written in the 60s, but we were working on it before then. Before the Republicans were in power here in North Carolina, they supported redistricting reform, as did we. But the Democrats were pretty silent on it during that time. Of course, they were gerrymandering, and they'd been doing it for 100 years. If you look at what's going on in Maryland, that was the other Supreme Court case, I believe, that was heard the same day on Tuesday. That's about the Democrats gerrymandering. And so, I guess it's all relative.
In Maryland, it was one district. In North Carolina, it's the whole state.
Well, the North Carolina is considered one of the worst states in terms of extreme gerrymandering.
So we'll get to the redistricting and gerrymandering maybe toward the end of the show, because this can be big.
Sure.
Big, long discussion. Mm-hmm. Do you wish you could endorse candidates? Do you find that the idea of trying to stay nonpartisan, I mean, the nonpartisan thing that I see is primarily in the not endorsing candidates.
It is.
Taking issues and position and favoring positions on issues, not particularly nonpartisan.
Well, it absolutely is strictly enforced as it relates to elections, right? But I would say it also impacts, I think, our tone and how we think about issues and how we speak about issues. We're not beholden to a political party, and we fall out of favor when we don't support something that somebody thinks that we should or should not.
You're not always the darling of the Democrats.
No, we're not. And I personally am not a Democrat. I have no loyalty to a political party. So I don't find it that difficult. In fact, I can speak from a personal standpoint. And that is, in my role as a league leader, having to remain nonpartisan when I speak on behalf of the league, and as an unaffiliated voter, I have found that it allows me to shift my thinking to be far more issue-oriented rather than making assumptions about whether something aligns with my so-called party or ideology. I would argue, if you look at voting patterns, the majority of the time the parties vote together. It's on these hot-button issues that we have disagreement. You never hear about, because they're not controversial, but they are nevertheless important, quite frankly.
I am also registered unaffiliated. When I moved to North Carolina, I registered Democrat. And after a couple of years, I thought, I don't want to be taken for granted. And then there's one maybe not so minor technical thing about it, is that in a primary, if you're unaffiliated, most of the time you can take a ballot from either party.
In this state, you can. Yes.
And anyone can find out which one you took.
Which is interesting.
Record.
Yes, it is public record.
So if you go look me up, you'll see I've taken a Republican ballot now and then. I think maybe once. I think maybe the presidential primary in 2016, maybe the only one that I did. So you can do that, and you can vote your one vote strategically, which I did because I didn't want to see Trump as the candidate. So I voted for one of the other Republicans. Didn't work very well, but I did it. But that doesn't mean that my politics aren't like 99.9% aligned with the left and Democrats. And you won't. I have voted for a Republican or two. I voted for Donnie Harrison. I voted for Steve Troxler. I think those are the two. Maybe Sherry Berry. But not very much. So what do you get from it? You get more media respect, or when someone talks about the League of Women Voters and looking at your voting guides and your issues, the TV stations, the newspapers, do they tend to respect that more than if you were aiming at a specific candidate?
I would hope so. What I can tell you is that nonpartisan stance is embedded in our history. So we've never budged from it. And there's some reasons that was done early on to be issue focused and not to endorse candidates, because women, it turns out if you looked at the first election, those women who were first voting, they did not overwhelmingly represent the Democrats or the Republicans. They voted in ways you might expect in other, if you look at other demographics. And so, we're a cross section. So how does it affect us today? So our motivation was not for increased respect and visibility in 1920. It really was about principles. But in terms of the effect, I think that it does increase our credibility. I think that it's one of the reasons that we are 99 years old and are likely to see our 200th anniversary eventually. I think it's critically important, though, because the League, more than any other organization across the nation, becomes a resource for voter information. So while the National League no longer hosts the presidential debates, they haven't done that since the 1980s, leagues across the nation do host candidate forums at all sorts of levels. So, for example, here in Wake County, we're hosting candidate forums just about every year, depending on those elections. So we'll be hosting, depending on the year, school board candidate forums, town council candidate forums in some of our municipalities. We always host the county commissioners candidate forums, and the league sponsors a separate platform called vote411.org for nonpartisan information about the candidates. Now, if we were not a nonpartisan organization, I think that would hurt our credibility in being able to host and present those forums in a way that it is fair and unbiased.
So do the candidates on the side of the positions, on the issues that may disagree with you, primarily these days, the Republicans, do they still participate willingly and gladly, or do you have to drag them kicking and screaming to a forum?
I would say it depends on the year, and it depends on the candidate. I think that here in Wake County, we've been around for a long time, and so in terms of local politics, I think people understand that we really are not hosting a candidate forum to drive our own agenda. So, for example, when we do candidate forums, our questions that are asked are not based on driving the league's agenda on our policy side. In fact, we try to keep a very distinct separation between our policy positions and what we do in terms of voter services. And we really do view it as a voter service, that we're providing a service to the public. And during that time, we're not advancing our own issues. So we identify we identify the issues that the voters seem to be interested in and make sure that those questions are asked in such a way that they're neutral, that they're not leading questions, but that the voters can get some feedback on how each candidate views an issue. And in the last few years, that has gone well. There were a few years ago, there was a little, disagreement from the GOP, and many of them essentially boycotted the candidate forum. That did not go over well with the general public. And
they learned a lesson there?
I don't know about a lesson. We don't really, aren't in the business of teaching politicians lessons, but I think that, it reinforced for us that the public does trust what we do. And I think for politicians...
the question is, did they come back next time?
Oh, yeah. And I think that I wasn't a league leader at that time, so I can't speak to the specifics. But we got past that. We were fine. And I think that what candidates have learned is that we really are fair in the way that we approach it. And we do not accommodate unreasonable demands from either party. In fact, that's why the National League refuses to do those anymore. It was both parties making unreasonable demands. But they also recognize we give them a free forum. We give politicians or candidates an opportunity to reach their voters during those candidate forums and on our platform at vote411.org.
So those forums end up on local TV?
Some of them do. WRAL, for most of our forums, live streams them and posts the full video of them on their website.
Okay, so they might not be on the TV channel, but you can...
Right. Typically, the entire forum is broadcast online and then accessible, and then they typically pick up part of it in the news that day.
Online has been a great resource. Mm-hmm. For some reason, the broadcast signal is still the big thing, but those of us savvy enough to go look online, we can find a whole lot more.
Right. At your leisure, too.
Issues. Mm-hmm. In the media, there's the horse race with public interest. And I'm going to say, you can argue with me if you want, the issues. Horse race up here. Everybody wants to know the horse race. How are the polls doing? Who's ahead? Mm-hmm. The actual issues, not so much. Mm-hmm. You're dedicated to the issues. How's that work out?
I guess I'm not sure I understand the question. Are you referring to, all sorts of candidates running and us wondering about who's going to file, who's
win,
running?
Yeah, who's going to win? Who's ahead in the polls? The battle, and then the candidates themselves are not deep into the issues. You ask them about the issues and say, "Oh, it's on my website. You can go find it there." Right. You try to dig them out for issues.
We do, and
first of all, do the candidates ever actually know the issues? And second, who cares?
Well, I think the voters do care. I think that our challenge is educating the voters to the extent that I think they need to be educated on an issue. But it's difficult. There's so much information out there. When it comes to the candidates and the politicians themselves, sometimes they don't know the issue that well. And I don't say that in a way that's meant to be a criticism of our elected officials. But in fact, at every level, go to a town council meeting sometime, look at the number of issues they deal with, how technical even what seems to be the most mundane things are. They're very technical. And imagining trying to become an expert in all of those. So I think that it's important that there are organizations like the League and other organizations that dig in on the issues to educate the public. We do see that during election time, when questions are asked, that candidates gloss over some issues, sometimes because they don't know it in depth, particularly if they're a first-time candidate. They're learning some of those issues as they're running, or if they're a a politician that hasn't served for very long, same thing. And sometimes they don't go into depth because the more depth you go into, that may be where you start finding the disagreements. And so I think that they're balancing things. How do you get votes and say just enough for people to understand generally where you stand?
Yeah, you don't want to take too much of a stand. I guess that's why governors can do better than senators in presidential elections, because senators have a deep, long voting record on all these issues, and governors not so much.
I think many people have suggested that, yeah.
And there's also the my eyes glaze over factor, and time, in a forum that you're doing an issue to really get into it. We won't talk about too many issues on this program, but when you guys come back, we can spend some time digging into some serious issues. But you can't do that in a forum, because you could spend an hour on something and
and we limit it to a 2-minute response, and how much can you say in 2 minutes, and so I do want to speak in defense of the candidates to some extent, that I think that they're giving enough information to indicate position for many voters. And going into the weeds sometimes is more than what people want. I do want to give you a second answer to that kind of horse race question, and why we spend so much time on what the polls are saying and who has filed for X election, whatever it may be. And I've been thinking about it lately, why we're so obsessed, for example, with who has filed for the Republican nomination and the Democratic nomination already for the presidential race, right?
Yeah.
When it's so early, why do you care at the moment? Other than just generally starting to watch a candidate. But
and I don't think very many people really are. The cable news shows are digging into it like crazy. People out there on the street, do they really care at this point?
I think it depends on who that person is. Those who are deeply involved in political information and following it, or they're engaged in political activity, I liken it to the baseball fan who follows the games, knows those statistics in detail, and it almost becomes it's almost a hobby, a passion. But people are passionate for very different reasons. I think it's good that people are engaged, though, and they are wondering who is running and listening to some new ideas. Of course, by the time the primaries roll around, a lot of that will be teased out.
Yeah, and that's part of where you guys come in. With so many candidates, getting an understanding of where they stand, even without a lot of depth, even more than an inch deep, but not a mile, is really hard.
It is.
And so I've been to League of Women Voters to find out more as we get closer to an election, and maybe more the down ticket, because those are the folks you're not going to see them on TV.
Right, and it's why I've mentioned it a couple times. I'm going to mention it again. We used to send out by mail voting guides. And every once in a while we'll ask people, we'll get emails, or someone will ask me, how do I get a voting guide? I didn't get one in the mail. We haven't sent them out in the mail for many years. And what we used to do is ask for candidates' statements and their answers to some basic questions, and we'd publish them, and we'd send them out to people in Wake County. Now we have an online platform called vote411.org, and we ask candidates to upload their own statements. And we do ask questions for some races, and they can upload their own answers. So again, they control it. We're not editing it. We're not in any way shifting it in terms of bias, because we really do want the voters to make up their own minds about who they should vote for based on the issues. And Vote 411 has replaced our old style hard copy voter guides. And the nice thing about that is that we're no longer limited in number of pages, right? Yeah. And it is difficult to find information about down ballot candidates. So if you want to know something about who's running for soil and water conservation, that can be a difficult thing, or finding information about sheriff in some counties can be a difficult thing. Yeah. Everyone looks at those top of ballot races where more money is being spent, and those local races are just as important. If you think about it, many of the things that affect your daily life are based on decisions that were made locally here by your school board, your county commission, and your town council. If you're driving down a road and the potholes aren't filled, for example, right?
And they're not.
Yeah. Well, those kinds of decisions are made at the local level, and unfortunately, I think voters aren't as informed on those issues because so much money is put into campaigns for top of the ballot races and candidates.
Yeah. So I was looking at your website. I was showing people this is the Vote 411 part. I'll go back to the home page. So you've got all this stuff on your website. And I was thinking as we were getting ready for this, this is the Wake County League of Women Voters. Mm-hmm. And there's a Orange, Durham, Chatham County League of Women Voters, and a Johnston County League of Women Voters. As we're looking across the Triangle area, that's a lot of people getting involved in a lot of nitty-gritty stuff.
Right. And what
shout out to your neighbors.
Right. And so what you're seeing is what happens in every state across the nation. So there are leagues in all 50 states. So every state has a state affiliate or chapter. So we have a League of Women Voters of North Carolina. And then at the county level, we have various leagues. Now, we don't have a league in every county because there have to be people or volunteers in a particular county willing to take the initiative and start that league. So Johnston County, for example, and I think you showed an example just now, they're a relatively new league, adjacent here to Wake County. Wake County is one of the older leagues in the state. We were established in 1920. And have been around since then, with the exception of a few years in the 1930s. We went dormant. But that's happening all across the country. And so what that means is you have local people engaged in grassroots activity, working not just on national issues. In fact, for the most part, here at the county level, we're working on local issues. And because the Wake County League happens to have the legislature in its county, many of our members are also working on state level issues.
The Tea Party movement started getting people paying more attention to politics than usual. The Trump election has gotten a lot more people paying attention. The MSNBC and Fox News and CNN, their ratings are all going up, getting a lot more attention on their political shows. Are you seeing that in interest in your membership? In the amount of people you get as members?
Sure.
How many members are there in Wake County?
We have about 300 members here in Wake County. So
is it good or pathetically low?
No, it's good because we're a different kind of organization. A lot of those members are members, but they send in their membership dues to just support us financially, which, of course, is very important.
I've been to a lot of clubs that do that.
Right, but a huge portion of our membership are what we consider active members, that they are volunteers in the organization. And so many organizations who, for example, have paid staff often look to us because we have more volunteers who are active on the ground. And then we make decisions about who we're going to partner with to leverage those resources.
Is there paid staff at any level, state level, national?
Not current. Well, yes. At the national level, there's an office in Washington, D.C. that is fully staffed. And then there are some state level leagues across the country that are large enough, for example, California, that have paid staff at their state level. And there may be a small handful of local chapters that have some paid staff. And we did at one point. We had a staff member, but because of technology and the internet and computers and things like that, we no longer need a typist or someone to answer the phones, those kinds of things. So
do you have an office?
We do have an office, but we don't really, we call it an office, but we really don't maintain it as an office so much as a place to keep supplies, but it's more of a meeting room and training room. So we use it for our committee meetings and for doing all sorts of training.
So how often are there activities for membership who want to do more than just be a member in name and want to come do something? How often do they have that opportunity?
Well, they could be involved in something several times a month. So typically we're offering one of our major events that happens almost monthly, except during the summer months. We call Timely Topics. It's a lunch. And half of those are paid sit-down luncheons, and the other half during the year are free brown bag lunches. They're open to the public, and we choose topics that we think are going to be of interest to both league members and the public. So, for example, the last one earlier this month, we had Ned Barnett from the News and Observer, the editor there, come in and talk about the importance of transparency in government, access to government records, access to meetings and open meetings, because it was Sunshine Week.
Yeah, I'm thinking contradiction in terms, oxymoron.
Right. But it was Sunshine Week, which is where particularly the media shines a light on the importance of the Freedom of Information Act and what we call sunshine laws, those open meeting laws. So,
and they work, just not as well as they should.
Right. And we're very involved in that, by the way, with our Observer Court. But then our next Timely Topics, which by the way, is already sold out before we even got a chance to promote it much. That one's on affordable housing. So we've covered redistricting, the Equal Rights Amendment, affordable housing, of course, transparency in government, all sorts of environmental issues, and it will vary from year to year and month to month. And so those are things that not just league members can attend, but the public can attend. And then there are things for league members. And for those who want to be active volunteers, what we encourage is that they join one of our committees. And we have lots of committees. Some of them are operational that help us run the organization, like a finance committee or a communications committee. But many of them are on issues. So we have a redistricting committee and an ERA committee and an environment committee and voting rights committee.
If you're going to put a position out in depth on all of these issues, that takes time and people.
It does. So, for example, within our Voter Services Committee, we've looked at a number of issues related to elections. And one of the groups within the Voter Services Committee did some in-depth research on technology that would allow the state to maintain better and more accurate records on voters. So every year you have accusations of voter fraud, right? That someone voted who should not have voted. And often those numbers are really inflated because once the investigation is done, you find out, well, that person had a right to vote. The accusation was because somebody had their same name, or they were also registered in another state because they used to live in that state 10 years ago and they're still on those rolls. But so ways to make sure that those are up to date. And they just produced a 32-page report on on recommendations for technology and best practices for maintaining voter records, and they're in the legislature, hoping to get an appropriation for that, so the State Board of Elections would be able to tap into what we believe is the the best system and following best practices. Well, to do a 32-page report means you need people who are interested in digging in and doing the research and writing it. And it took a team. And one of the things that I love about the League is that, you know, there are lots of organizations that you can go and do volunteer activities. And we offer things where if you just want to do a one-time volunteer activity that only takes a few hours, or show up at one event and just help out an event, you can do that. But if you want a seat at the table for an organization in terms of helping to make the decisions on an issue and the direction for that issue, the League provides unlimited opportunities for doing that. So as a result, our members are I just think they're extraordinary.
My experience with things like that is it's 90% showing up. And you may be vetted some. And you may be watched for a while to see that you're not going off on a wild goose chase someplace. But if you're doing a pretty good job, you get more responsibility than you can handle fast.
If you want it.
Yeah.
And so we're constantly telling people we have more things that need to be done than we have volunteers, but we never want to overwhelm someone. And all they have to do is put the brakes on and say, this is all I can do. And we respect that. But again, I think that people put in those hours. I am an unpaid full-time volunteer for the League, and I have been for almost 2 years now.
But does that mean you don't have a full-time job someplace?
I don't anymore. So I set my consulting work aside.
And when you go into McDonald's and order a Big Mac, you can't say, I'm with the League of Women Voters, give me a Big Mac. They want money.
Right. Well, fortunately, you know, I get some royalties from some textbook publishing that I do, and I have a husband that is very supportive that has another income.
Okay.
And
so I'm retired, and my wife makes a lot of money. So
right. And what I will say is, so who are active volunteers in the League? Many of them are professionals who are now retired. And many of them are people who are still working, but they have flexibility in their work schedule for whatever reason. Either some flexibility in working from home where they can set their own hours, or they own their own business. So
the boss is saying they'd be on Facebook anyway, or might as well have them do something productive.
Well, or, you know, they might be working at the job at 9:00 at night at their computer, but at a League meeting at 3:00 in the afternoon.
So I was going to ask about age ranges of your volunteers. Mm-hmm. A lot of organizations that have been around for a long time are gentrifying and having a hard time getting young people. How does it work for you guys?
We still need more diversity in terms of age. The reality of the League is that because we're all volunteer and it takes a lot of hours to do a lot of those things. Most of our volunteers are retired or that have that flexible work schedule. However, in the last couple of years, we have increased the number of members who are younger. So a few in their, not many in their 20s, but we've had some there, but 30s and 40s who are working and raising families and are members of the League, some just supporting us with their membership dollars or showing up at occasional events when they can make the time. Others who are in that younger demographic for the League, but are active volunteers, and often what they're doing is volunteer activity they can do from their home at their computer, which is most of volunteer work for the League. You can do it from your computer at home. Yeah,
you don't have to be at central places anymore.
Exactly.
And it's been the case for, I don't know, a decade or more. Somebody in their 20s shows up, they treated like a kid?
No, absolutely not. No, I would say when someone in their 20s shows up, we're very excited that they're interested in the League. In fact, we're actively recruiting people who are younger. So we've now instituted a free membership for students. High school and college students can join the League absolutely for free, and we've gained some members that way, and other members who are younger and who've paid the full membership. But no, what's exciting about us is they have skill sets often that those of us who are older are learning because we didn't grow up with having those skill sets almost by second nature, and they're interested in different things. And so I hope we never treat anyone as if they're immature or too young for us, but rather they bring some different insights and some different skills to the table.
Yeah, there's a whole different way of looking at the world.
Absolutely, which I think is pretty exciting. I think that the younger generation sometimes is much maligned, and there's some pretty exciting things about them that we should be recognizing.
Yeah, I mean, some young people will look at me and say, "Get out of the way, old man. This is not your world anymore." And I'll say, "Wait a minute, I still got more money than you do." But you still have to listen, because they will have perspectives that just don't make sense to us anymore.
Absolutely.
And I'll think back to when I was 25, and I remember what the world was like then and what I thought, and it is not the same world. Mm-hmm. So they've got something different.
Well, and they function in it differently if you think about it. When I was 25, there were no cell phones. There was certainly no internet. There was no social media. And so,
what did we do?
Right. And I think all of those things are great, by the way. And, those of us who are older, we hopefully have incorporated those things into our lives so we stay in touch with what's going on in the world. But their world is different. And I think that we can't deny that. I don't think it's about whether it's better or worse. It's about recognizing that difference, and it results in different perspectives.
Yeah. And it's not a value judgment. It's just different.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've been in technology all of my life, and I try to keep up, but it's hard. Mm-hmm. And I definitely cannot type 40 words a minute with 2 thumbs. Can't do that. And I see kids do that, and it just blows me away. We talked about your volunteers, and I want to tie 2 subjects together, because I had tossed at you the idea of, why is it the League of Women Voters? Mm. Why don't we take the women out? But is there a League of Voters possibility?
Not at this time, I don't think. And what I will say is that was discussed at one point in our history.
I mean, Boy Scouts.
Right.
If you haven't paid attention, Boy Scouts now have girls.
Right, they now have girls.
And it's not Boy Scouts, it's Scouting BSA.
Right.
Scouting
right.
KFC.
Mm-hmm. And so, there's some pros and cons there. And as I understand the discussion, because we're approaching our centennial year, I've been digging in our archives, learning more about our history. Is it going to be a party? They're going to be big parties. Yes, all year long it will be a party for us. But in the name, there are a couple really important considerations. One is it's 99 years old and is a very strong and respected national brand, so to speak. So to change the name is a risky thing to do, right? The other argument for keeping the name is in recognition of that history. Again, our predecessor organization was that Equal Suffrage Association, and we would not exist if it wasn't for the fight for equal suffrage. And while there were male suffragists, there were a lot of men who supported votes for women. It was still mostly women. And the League today, its membership is still largely women. It's the nature of who we are. And that brand is so strong and it's respected and we're all comfortable with it. So we've kept it. Now, having said that, we have members who are men.
Okay, that was going to be my next question.
Yes.
See, we're heading there.
Absolutely. We not only have members who are men, we have members who are men who are active in the league. So they're active volunteers, and not just because their wives joined, though, admittedly.
Dear, we're going to the League of Women Voters meeting tonight, dear.
Admittedly, most of them joined because their wives joined first, but then they opted independently to get involved. So, we have men who chair committees. We have men who are very active within committees. Recently, not at the moment, but recently we had a man on the board for the state League of Women Voters. I would anticipate that would eventually be the case from time to time. The local level, we have men who present, who are members, and are very active. And so it's not the league for women. It's mostly made up of women, and it really is a nod more to our history than anything else.
So when we get something like that, I want to branch out in a couple directions, and I don't always remember which to incorporate them all. So I'll try this one first. Mm-hmm. What do these days especially? What do women specifically bring from your gender's perspective to an organization like that would be different than if there were a lot more men involved?
Oh, to our organization?
Yeah. Well, to your organization, and I guess you can broaden it out to politics in general. Because a lot of men will think, what's the point? Why is there a difference?
Well, I think that it's interesting you asked that question today in the year 2019.
We've elected a whole bunch more women.
We've elected a lot more women, but, within the larger context in the last, couple years of the Women's March, the Me Too movement, those kinds of things, I think that it's becoming more and more evident that women experience the world differently. And that what has been critically important is that women have had to be very vocal and sometimes very painful ways about how they've been treated and how they experience the world in order to affect change. For example, in the workplace and in relationships and in politics. So representation of women in politics. Removing sexual harassment and sexual discrimination in the workplace. Those kinds of issues have become much more to the forefront. I think that finally, what we've been talking about it for a long time, for example, in the workplace, and all sorts of legislation was passed, I think that we're having much more open and honest discussions about both the very overt and sometimes the more subtle ways that women are affected in different aspects of their life.
There's a lot of men whose eyes are being opened and who have behaved like themselves for their career, whether it's 10, 20, 30, 40 years, especially those in the 30 and 40 year version that looked back at that behavior and said, that's just all I had learned. That's all I ever did. I never really meant to be disrespectful. I'm not talking about the predators. I'm talking about the guys that you would normally say was a nice guy, but he looked at your legs. And they're waking up, and because I'm one of them, and not necessarily happily waking up. Some of it's uncomfortable, and some of it's I didn't deserve that.
And I think that that's what gives me hope.
And there are some that are still
not just
jerks.
about this issue, but hope for our nation. Because I think that increasingly we're seeing people who are recognizing that how they were raised. Remember, we are not raised in a vacuum. We are a product of our culture and a context, right? And times have changed. And certainly over history, there have been lots of people who were kind of ahead of the curve and they saw inequities and could articulate them before many others. But we're now living in a time where people are starting to grapple with, I think, in much more open and honest ways, issues of racism, homophobia, and misogyny in ways that they never thought were wrong 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. Now, I find that is hopeful because you cannot solve a problem if you don't recognize it. And when we're talking about things that really start at an individual level, that requires individuals to recognize those issues and biases within themselves.
But we still have a big part of male society that, as our president once said, it's tough being a man today.
Well, I think that that depends, and I'm going to make a comment not on behalf of the League of Women Voters, but on behalf of me, Diana Wynn, and I think that it may not be quite so tough for a wealthy white man as it is for a young black man, and so I think that when we talk about perspective, we need to understand that different people experience life differently.
So I didn't know how I was going to get into asking about this, but I guess I will. I was listening to a woman talk on a show sometime fairly recently, and she was talking about her experience in protests and activism, and she said that she was able to do things as a middle-aged white woman from a position of privilege that people younger or of different colors couldn't do. I mean, they could try, but they could, but she was much less likely to have serious repercussions in her life, like being arrested. So women do have various stratus and levels in society, and
oh, absolutely. I was arrested a few years ago as part of the Moral Monday protests, and that was a very intentional decision on my part. And I was fully aware of the fact that I was doing it from a place of privilege, because at that time I think I was 50 years old. I had done what I wanted to do professionally. I had nothing at risk. I could afford bail. I could afford an attorney. So and it was a misdemeanor. It just
it's one of those just
matter.
Hanging around in the legislature.
It was being in the legislature, and quite frankly, personally, I know people were protesting different things. What drove me to make the decision to be arrested was that I knew that the rules of the building were unconstitutional in terms of not allowing people in during acts of protest when they were peaceful. I knew that I had the means of seeing that court case through once arrested all the way through the appellate phase. And so absolutely I did that from a position of privilege. And I had people come to me afterwards and thank me for doing it. And I thought, well, all I did was I allowed them to cuff me and put me in a cell. I mean, it took no real effort on my part, but almost apologizing that they weren't doing that and explaining why. It was because they had risk. They had professional risk. They had financial risk. And I think that we have to respect that fact.
Just doing my job.
Well, I think we have to respect that, I can be a full-time unpaid volunteer for the League because of my privilege, quite frankly.
Yeah. Were there any repercussions afterwards? Was it dismissed? Do you have a record?
They actually put me on trial, and I was convicted.
These are the things the audience will eat up. So.
I was convicted at the trial level. It was an interesting trial because had they just asked me, were you there? Did you do this? I would have said yes to everything. But it took 2 or 3 hours. Showed video of me to prove that I was there. I expected to be convicted. I think that that's what the lower court had to do based on the law at the time, and then put in notice of appeal. And there were over 900 of us arrested. So of course, there were a lot of us who did not take a plea deal. Hundreds of us. And before my appeal could be heard. It kept being shifted. It was probably going to be years before they could get to it. The ruling was made that, in fact, the rules of the building were unconstitutional, and the case was dismissed.
So everybody got dismissed from that. I think I remember
in other words, I
stories.
feel like I won. And so
but if you
that's what it
if you
took.
hadn't put yourself out, you and 900 other people, if you hadn't stood your ground, that rule wouldn't have been changed.
I agree, and I have to say I no longer participate really in protest activity. That's where I was at that time in my activism, and I think that there is an important place for protest, because often what it does is it draws attention to an issue that gets no attention otherwise. I mean, think about all the things that are going on, and a 30-minute news show, let's say. Subtract 15 minutes of it for sports, weather, and traffic,
and
right?
Commercials.
And then you've got 15 minutes that includes human interest stories. There's hardly any time that can be devoted, even if your issue makes it. But I have shifted more to what I consider kind of the business end of political activity. And it's about getting voters informed on issues and empowering others within the league. But I think that people decide how they should be politically engaged. I think people should choose what's right for them. If that's protest, that's right for them. If that's being involved in an organization like what I'm doing, then that's right for them. If that's being involved in their particular political party, being precinct chairs for your party, then that's right for you.
Yeah. I am 69. This is the first year that I have been particularly activist in almost anything. Last year, I saw a notice from some group that said they were looking for people that would go on to college campuses and try to get people to sign up to do voter registration, but primarily with the idea to end gerrymandering. And I said, oh, okay, that seems innocuous enough. And I met a couple of very young people, and they looked at this guy and said, Grandpa. And we went over to Wake Tech, and my job was to walk up to students at random and say, are you familiar with the concept of gerrymandering, and would you like to see more fair elections? And most people were more aware of the situation than I thought they would be. Mm-hmm. And they signed our petition, and if they weren't registered to vote, they took a card to get registered to vote. Mm-hmm. That was my 69 years old. Mm-hmm. That was my first.
That's fantastic.
And I'm doing other things that, I volunteered with the Women's March. I'm the guy that arranged for the porta potties.
Now, you sound like an ideal League of Women Voters member.
Well, okay.
A lot of whom, when they retire, that's when they become politically active, when they have time to devote. I may be a good model.
Yeah. So, I'm like you're telling your volunteers, limit yourself. Don't get sucked into everything, try to do everything at once. Mm-hmm. And I've had to learn how to do that across my life. And for a while I didn't, and it was a big problem. And now I'm pretty good at that. I've set my sights on what I want to do.
Right. But your path is not that unusual. Thing. It's when you have time.
Yeah. So that's why I'm the model.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So podcasting is what I want to do. But I'm doing a few other things. This morning I was standing out on a driveway at an abortion clinic as an escort. And I do that a couple days a week, for a few hours. And those are some things I've specifically chosen to spend my time doing. Mm-hmm. So you won't find me at your office, but no, but maybe somebody like me.
And I've occasionally done workshops on advocacy training. And what I like to start with, for people wanting to know how to engage in advocacy, I like to take a couple steps back and first encourage people to set priorities, because there's so many issues and we care about so many issues, and you cannot address them all as an individual. And then there's so many things you can do, and that you personally have to set your priorities on what issues and then determine what activities fit your skill set, your particular interests, and your lifestyle.
Yeah. And there are literally dozens and dozens and maybe even hundreds of groups that you could be part of that are in the activist community.
Yes.
You know, like your co-plaintiffs with common cause
Right.
in the gerrymandering thing. There's all the indivisible groups that I think have popped up fairly recently, you know, in less than a decade.
They were formed after the 2016 election.
That you only hear a little bit about. I mean, I've started picking names out of the newspaper as I come across them and putting them on a list of possible groups to call and say, come talk to me about what you are. Because I see a short mention in one newspaper article and then you don't hear from them again. But they've got their group of 10, 100 people passionate about what they're doing, and they pick that niche.
Right.
So there's a lot of different things to do.
Right.
Today we're promoting the League of Women Voters. The men that are involved. Have they had to learn not to mansplain?
Well, I don't know. I would imagine that if anyone was engaging that behavior, he would quickly discover that wouldn't go over well.
Won't work well there.
No.
Is there women's splaining? Do we have a gender
I say
equivalent?
we have people who are active in the league, whether they're men or women, have strong opinions and they're driven by passion.
Okay. So maybe there is a little bit.
So there can be debate. There's certainly lots of discussion.
Yeah. Well, I guess the mansplaining part comes not only with passionate exposition of their position, but an attitude.
Sure.
Like I am better. I know more, and it's mostly because I'm male and you're female. So listen to me. Here we go. So we've hit a little bit past an hour. Are you having fun?
Sure. Yes.
Okay. I do want to talk about gerrymandering.
Great.
And there are a lot of other things to do, so maybe we can do this a few more times.
Okay.
Many, many more times if you're willing. The gerrymandering in North Carolina, as you said, is one of the more extreme cases in the country. Just statistically, you can look at the last election in 2018, last November, when just barely over 50% of the people voting for Congress voted Republican, and just a little bit under 50% voted Democrat. And there would have been maybe closer to straight 50-50, except in the second district, there was no Democrat running.
Right.
Walter Jones district. There was no Democrat running, so that no Democrat votes could be counted because there weren't any.
Well, that's one of the effects of gerrymandering.
So we can call North Carolina just about 50-50 in the actual vote if you tallied it up statewide. We have 13 members in our congressional district, the U.S. Congress.
For representatives, yeah.
10 Republicans, 3 Democrats.
Right.
50-50 vote. 10 Republicans, 3 Democrats. What's wrong with this picture?
Right. And what's wrong with it is, in fact, gerrymandering. So I think that it's fair to refer to North Carolina as a purple state rather than a red state or a blue state. And the reason is that, you know, we can get into the specific numbers, but I don't think we need to. And that is that we have roughly about the same number of registered Democrats, registered Republicans, and unaffiliated voters. So what that would suggest is that in our legislature and in Congress, that there would be more of a balance between Democrats and Republicans who are elected, and that it may lean one direction or the other from one election to another, that you would have some years you'd have maybe 1 or 2 more Democrats elected, and then the next election it might just be the opposite, that you're going to have some districts that are kind of swing districts. But that's not how we're built.
If you look at gerrymander-proof elections, governor, lieutenant governor, senators, that is exactly what's happening.
What happens, but for those top of ballot ones that are statewide elections, that they're less predictable for that very reason. So we're a purple state. And but in terms of our elected officials, we are a solidly red state, right? So there's something wrong with that math. And it didn't happen by accident, right?
Yeah. And as you mentioned, the Democrats did it for 100 years.
The Democrats did it for 100 years. And again, the League has been in favor of redistricting reform long before the GOP won the majority in the state legislature. And many of them who are still around were in favor of redistricting reform until they got power, right? Gerrymandering is about
that
power.
happened in 2010.
2011. So, yeah, the election happened in 2010.
Yeah, and
right.
they got into office in 2011.
Right.
And as happens every 10 years, there's a census. Mm-hmm. And the census drives the next round of redistricting.
Right.
It says, well, we got more people in this county or more people in this area, less people in that area. So it's time to reapportion the districts.
Reapportionment's a little different because that happens more on a national level. But what's really important is, like you mentioned, you went to the college campus and you were surprised that more people had heard about redistricting. Yeah. And, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it's hard to get people interested in it, and now it's front page news. Now that's the good news, at least for the League of Women Voters, that when we go out and talk about redistricting reform and ending gerrymandering, the word gerrymandering is no longer this foreign term for a lot of people. It is for many, but not as much as it used to be. But there is some confusion, I think. And I understand. It's not like I've always understood how redistricting works. It's important that, your listeners understand that redistricting is a good thing. Redistricting has to happen every 10 years because population changes. So, for example, in this state, we have rural counties that are losing population. But, for example, Wake County is gaining in population. So over time, you're going to have to rebalance those numbers to make sure that people are represented. Because we have a one person, one vote rule. So redistricting is good. The problem is that politicians have always drawn those district lines when they drew an election map to favor their particular political party or to disenfranchise a particular group. Often it's racial gerrymandering. That's the group that's being disenfranchised, are people of color. And the Democrats did do it for 100 years because they were in control. Here's what changed, and it didn't just impact North Carolina. The GOP launched what they called the Red Map program or project, and they didn't do it in secret. It was all in the open, but they looked at things and realized that strategically, if they could focus on the states and redrawing those districts, that would impact who got elected to the state legislatures, right? And who does the map drawing for the congressional the legislature. Districts. It's the state legislature.
And it's not the whole legislature.
Right. It's not the whole legislature, but whoever's in power is going to be drawing those. And the other, so it was very intentional. And the other difference is that we're living in a different time in terms of technology. That mapping technology is so precise that even the less sophisticated, like Google Maps, you can hone in on a single house, right? So imagine more sophisticated mapping technology that can go precinct by precinct and predict how the majority in that precinct are likely to vote in an election and then manipulate the voting maps based on that election data to guarantee elections.
Our ballots are still secret.
Yes.
Barely.
Well, your ballot is secret. The fact that you voted is not. So I can go online to the State Board of Elections or the County Board of Elections, and I could look you up, and I could see what elections you have voted in, it won't tell me how you voted. If you voted in a primary, I can tell whether you voted in the Democratic primary or whether you voted in the Republican primary. But your ballot is a secret ballot.
But our precincts are small.
The precincts are small, so
A few hundred to maybe a few thousand
Right,
voters.
so-
And you can tell at that level which way things went.
it's about, predictability when you bring it down to smaller groups. And so what kind of data is being used? Your party affiliation, that's public record, that's being used.
So register unaffiliated. I recommend it.
Well, I don't recommend one way or the other. You register whatever your political preference is.
Well,
but
if you were to register unaffiliated, you would throw your tiny little monkey wrench into that gerrymandering system.
you potentially could. An unaffiliated voter voting in the primaries can choose whichever ballot they want to vote in. And there's nothing wrong with doing that.
But they're still going to see which way your precinct went.
But at the precinct level, that data is going to be there. All
And I
that
think
data
that's gonna
is
be the-
publicly available.
That's going to be the smallest geographical entity that you can tell went Republican, Democrat, and by how much at the precinct level.
Right. So all of that data is available and has been used. In addition,
Throw it into the computer.
right, and it becomes even more mean-spirited when a particular candidate's home will be intentionally drawn in to a district so they can run in that district, or intentionally they're already an elected official drawn out of that district so they can't run for their seat again. All of that are the tactics of gerrymandering. So what happens? That means that your district might be a so-called safe district for a Democrat or a safe district for a Republican. And the result is politicians don't have to be that accountable to us constituents anymore. In fact, if you're in a safe district and you're up for re-election, depending on that district and how safe it is, you might not even need to knock on doors for your re-election.
We're sitting here in the 4th district. David Price is the congressperson, and he won with 73% of the vote. Yay! No, it's not yay.
That's not good. And I've tried to explain to people it doesn't matter. If you're sitting in a safe district, you should still care about gerrymandering, even if it's your candidate that is getting elected and being in that safe district, because that elected official is simply not as accountable to you as they would be otherwise. They don't have to work very hard for your vote and to keep their seat. So that means they may not be communicating to the constituents as often or as much as they need to. For example, you bring an issue to them that you're passionate about, maybe a lot of people in your community are passionate about. They don't really have to care about it if they're sitting in a safe district.
I did give David Price the fist bump at Women's March. He walked the line with all the tables, glad handing everybody. So he got out there. Okay, so now what do we do about it? What happened Tuesday?
So what do we do about it? There have been two approaches to addressing it. Trying to get new legislation, and I can talk about that in a minute. We so far have not been able to do that, though there are some pending bills right now. But that has left us, unfortunately, with the other option, and that has been litigation. And so North Carolina has had, I don't want to say more lawsuits than any other state in the nation, but it's way up there in terms of the number of redistricting-related lawsuits starting in 2011 after the last redistricting. Texas has had a lot also. And the Supreme Court case that was heard Tuesday, that case, the origins of that case, it was originally filed in 2011. So it has been going back and forth through the courts on various issues So it's been a live case for many years, and finally went to the Supreme Court. Now, Common Cause had a separate case that they had brought, and what happened is in a lower court, the judges decided to combine those two cases. So they do have some separate approaches, and they're being represented by different attorneys.
Yeah. I want to give you congratulations on being et al. I'm looking at the Oyez website. It's the Supreme Court blog, and looking for this case. I was kind of hoping that they'd have the audio out by now. Usually they put the audio out on Friday, but it's probably going to be still a little bit later.
Yeah.
So looking at it, it's Robert Rucho, one of our representatives, state representatives, against Common Cause et al.
Right.
You're the et al.
We're the et al. Because it was two cases combined, and I don't know if there was any particular reason that Common Cause's name goes first, but they were just combined.
Yeah. But then down here where they list the advocates and lawyers, and they've got theirs, that's the Emmett Bondurant, and then yours, Allison Riggs. Now, is this all being done by the North Carolina version of the League of Women Voters? Yeah,
that particular lawsuit, the plaintiff is the League of Women Voters of North Carolina, because it is it affects districts statewide. And we've had a more recent lawsuit that we won. It didn't get a lot of press, that only dealt with some districts here in Wake County. But even then, we asked that the League of Women Voters of North Carolina, kind of, we're a tiered organization, that they were the named plaintiff in it. But then we had 4 individual Wake County League members. But so the North Carolina League is the plaintiff. But all the local leagues, we're part of that organization, if that makes sense. And it's the Southern Coalition for Social Justice that represents us. It's their attorneys. So Allison Riggs with that organization. Okay.
So getting to the Supreme Court has been a while.
Yes.
It's been a couple of different legal decisions, including heading up to the Supreme Court and getting bounced back to federal district court. And you keep winning.
We keep winning, and
what good has it done?
We estimated at some point when we were trying to list all of the redistricting lawsuits that have happened here in North Carolina, not just since 2011, but even predating, but particularly since starting in 2011, that we estimate well over 80% of the time we win. We win. Sometimes it's a partial win. Part of the decision will go in our favor. Another part will get, bounced back. And that's part of what's been happening in this case. Parts of the case have been decided, and then it's bounced back for other reasons. So why does the legislature continue to do this when they keep losing these lawsuits?
Because they can, and they know how.
They can, and from a strategic standpoint, if what you want to do is maintain your position and ability to continue to manipulate those maps, then it's about dragging out those lawsuits. And so it doesn't really, the threat of a lawsuit doesn't seem to have mattered. So it's never been about a threat of a lawsuit. It's always been, this is our last resort for getting fair maps or to remedy a problem either with racial or partisan gerrymandering. Unfortunately, it has cost the taxpayers millions of dollars for the legislature to defend these lawsuits, in spite of the fact that they keep losing them. But it buys them time. Yeah. And when they have time, they can continue to gerrymander.
The last federal district decision was before the 2018 election, but the Republicans appealed and dragged things out to the point where the judge said, I'm ordering you to redraw the maps, but it's too late.
Exactly. Right.
So we went, they have been tinkered with a little bit since 2011.
Oh, they've been tinkered with quite a lot since 2011 here and there.
But it didn't help much.
What it typically did when they were tinkered with, that is when they had to fix them, it's when the plaintiffs could prove racial gerrymandering.
Yeah.
And there was some egregious, well, I think all racial gerrymandering is egregious, but the extent to which there was racial gerrymandering in the state, it was just shameful. Many of the maps that were redrawn were a result of racial gerrymandering, which the courts have been clear on. That is impermissible. You cannot draw the lines to disadvantage or disenfranchise a particular racial group, right? What the unsettled question is the issue of partisan gerrymandering, and in particular extreme partisan gerrymandering. And that's what the case is about now. It started out as a racial gerrymandering case in the beginning. So, and they were ordered to fix the districts. So the case that we're talking about that went to the Supreme Court first was a racial gerrymandering case. Legislature was ordered to redraw the districts. Racial gerrymandering is not permissible. So they said, okay, but partisan gerrymandering, that's fair game. So they were really upfront. I think it was Lewis that said he didn't draw 11 districts because he didn't think he could get 11. He did the maximum he could to draw safe districts for the GOP. So when they went back to fix the racially gerrymandered districts, they engaged in extreme partisan gerrymandering. And so the case kind of morphed into a different kind of case over the years. Just a different
label for the same.
It very often is. Very often the extreme partisan gerrymandering is done in such a way it's done under the name of partisan gerrymandering because they've been able to get away with that. It's been permitted so far, but it's what it is it's kind of covering racial gerrymandering or in some way disenfranchising some sort of community of interest.
Yeah. And if it's just happens to be the Democratic community of interest, well, that's okay. Mm-hmm. At least so far. Mm-hmm. But
right. And again, in all fairness, the Democrats did this. So what's the difference?
And they did racial gerrymandering too.
They did. They did racial gerrymandering also. The difference is the Republicans were, quite frankly, more savvy about it. They did it with much more precision, and now they have the technology available to them to be able to do it fairly easily with that kind of precision. Now, the good news is with technology, we can also recognize extreme gerrymanders, just statistically recognize when a district has been drawn in such a way to guarantee an advantage to a particular party.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to listening to the case when it comes up on Oyez.
I am too. We had several members of the league here from Wake County who went to the Supreme Court. They were able to get in. You stand in line starting, I think, before 4 a.m. in order to actually get in and get a seat in the court. They were able to get in and sit in through the arguments. We had many rallying outside on the steps of the Supreme Court. The others of us were anxious to actually, hear those recordings.
Look what's here.
Oh, has it gone up?
For those that are watching or listening, I'm trying to get this started here.
We'll hear argument first this morning in case 18-422, Rucho versus Common Cause. Mr. Clement?
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court. This court has repeatedly failed to identify...
This runs an hour and 11 minutes. I'm not going to go through very much of it here. I will do another episode where I will just play this for you. So we'll do that right away once we've concluded this one, if you want to listen to this.
Rather, the root cause of this failure is the basic decision of the framers to give responsibility for congressional districting to political actors. the framers consciously chose to give the primary authority to state legislatures, and then to police the possibility that state legislatures, which the framers knew to be partisan institutions, would engage in too much partisanship, the framers chose a structural solution by giving the federal Congress supervisory authority.
It's going to be interesting.
Now, that's obviously the attorney on behalf of the legislature who was speaking.
Yeah, he's saying that this is okay because this is the way it was all set up back in ancient history.
And it was, and in our state constitution, the legislature has the authority to do redistricting. Yeah. The question is, at what point does an extreme partisan gerrymander start to violate a voter's constitutional rights?
Yeah, the one person, one vote thing.
It's one person, one vote. The attorneys for the League of Women Voters, Allison Riggs, with the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, they presented a particular theory of the case. So it wasn't just based on the one person, one vote principle, because that's largely about population, making sure we have equal population from one district to another.
Yeah, that didn't used to be the case.
That used to not be the case. So now that is enshrined in, court precedent. So you have to have equal population, which is why we have to do redistricting every 10 years. But Allison Riggs, among many arguments, went for a First Amendment argument. So, for example, your freedom of association, the fact that you affiliate with a particular party, the fact that you have participated in an election, those kinds of that essentially you're penalized as a result. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that's a very simplistic way.
It makes sense to me. Well, it makes sense to the Supreme Court.
Right. And it's a simplistic way of putting it. And I can, maybe for another show, bring you one of or several of our redistricting committee co-chairs, one of whom is an attorney, to talk about those arguments.
Yeah, it will be cool to do that. So they made their pitch an hour. These things run about an hour at the Supreme Court on Tuesday, and the decision won't be rendered until June, I think. Is what people are predicting.
I think that.
Yeah, they start releasing opinions in May and end up by the end of June, and people are kind of expecting this one to come pretty much toward the end. Don't know why.
Well, they've been kicking back redistricting cases or gerrymandering cases.
Because this has been there before. It's
been there before, and this time they heard both the Maryland case, which I think also the League. I don't know if the League of Women Voters out of there was a plaintiff, but they certainly were involved in that. And the combined case of Common Cause and the League of Women Voters of North Carolina. So, they were waiting on, I guess, waiting on making some decisions and waiting on certain fact sets in order to determine how they were going to rule.
I've heard a more political description of why they combined these two, and that is so that the Supreme Court could have a Democrat case and a Republican case and not appear to be overtly political one way or the other.
Yeah,
they wanted both.
And maybe that's the case. But I don't know if that was their motivation.
You'll never get anybody to admit that.
I certainly think, right, exactly. I think that was a good thing, because having both those cases before the court on the same day really emphasizes that this is not a partisan issue. Right?
Yeah, it seems like it here.
Right. It does, only because, in any given state, it's going to seem like a partisan issue depending on who's in power. It's a question of who is in power in that state. So currently, it's the Republicans. But if we were arguing this case 20 years ago, it'd be just the opposite. But I think that way it really emphasizes that this is done by both parties, and the impact on the voters is the same, regardless of which party does it. And it's gotten so extreme that it may now rise to issues of constitutional violations.
So you and I haven't had a chance to listen to this. Have you been over the written transcript's been out for a while?
I have not had a chance. Yeah.
So all I can work with is what descriptions I've heard in various news and opinion programs, and that is that the justices are pretty much agreed that extreme partisan gerrymandering exists. And the question is, do they have the tools to fix it?
Do they have the tools to fix it? And I think the other is not just do they have the tools to fix it, because I think we believe they do have the tools to fix it.
But
do they want to fix it?
The Supreme Court likes to make narrow decisions. They don't like to make big, fat, broad decisions.
And so here's what's important to remember. Regardless of how they decide this case, so let's say they decide this case in our favor and districts have to be redrawn before we get to the 2020 elections. Let's say that it's drawn, it comes in our favor. That does not solve that does not solve our problem. Because courts tend to come to narrow decisions, and more often than not, they're going to, in their rulings, tell you what you can't do rather than tell you what you must do and how to do it, right? So they rarely tell you how to do it, but it's often an order to fix it rather than this is how you might go about fixing it. It's more of this is what you can't do. So I would suggest to you that even if we have a favorable ruling, our work is not done. The work still has to be done in the legislature to pass legislation on getting fair maps when we redistrict. There are 2 bills pending that have been introduced. There are rumors that there could be 1 or 2 more introduced. I don't know. So we'll have to see about them. One of the bills that's been introduced proposes legislation where the legislators would still be involved, but they would select people that would be on a commission that would recommend the maps. There's a problem with both bills, quite frankly. Neither of them are perfect, but one does it through legislation. The other one is a proposed constitutional amendment. And goes that route.
Which is the North Carolina's version of just citizen initiatives. Sort of.
Well, we don't have citizen initiative in this state, meaning in other states, if an organization or a group of citizens got together and, let's say, got enough names on a particular petition, depending on the process in that state, if they got enough people who said we want an initiative on a ballot, they could get it on the ballot. And that is how a lot of redistricting reform has happened in other states.
We can't do that here.
We can't do that.
But those 6 amendments from last November, they seem more like citizen initiative.
They had nothing to do with citizens initiating them.
No, but they were the level of things that other states would do as initiatives, not amendments.
Yeah, they were constitutional amendments, and they were all proposed by the legislature. And there are different theories as to why certain ones were on the ballot. Some would argue that some of those items were on the ballot just to drive turnout among certain populations.
That's pretty much what I thought. So what is the constitutional amendment proposal that would deal with gerrymandering? How does that handle it?
So that one, and I read it when it first came out a few weeks ago.
I'll show people the pile of papers you got to work with.
Yeah. That one is referred to House Bill 140, House Bill 140, and it proposes to amend the Constitution. Now, both of them have some sort of commission. Again, I read them both a few weeks ago when they, like within an hour of them coming out. So the H-141 actually does not involve a commission as much. So there are 2 bills. One is H-69. That's the one that wants to change it just purely through legislation. The other one, H-140, proposes a constitutional amendment. The one that just through a legislative process proposes essentially an advisory commission. But the leaders of the parties within each chamber would choose who's on the commission. And there are requirements for who can and can't be on the commission. So no elected officials would serve on that, but would be an advisory commission, and that commission would draw the maps. And that they would be prohibited from using things like your political affiliation and your voting history and those kinds of things. So there's wording in both bills about what kind of criteria should be used and what kind of data cannot be used. Now, the one that involves a constitutional amendment, that's H-140, it has the legislative staff draw the maps. It's the Legislative Services Office who work within the legislature, but they are technically nonpartisan. Some have argued that they're less nonpartisan than they used to be. I think that's a different debate, and that's not something I can really speak to. But that body would draw the maps, and then whichever way you went, either the one that has an advisory commission, or the one with the constitutional amendment where the Legislative Services Office draws the map, it would then go to the legislature, and they would be able to vote yes or no with no amendments. So it would be a process where no amendments would be accepted, which is good, because the moment you start putting amendments in, that's when you start inserting all the gerrymandering. I would say what appears to be the problem with both bills is that if they don't pass the maps on the first vote, then it goes back to whatever body was assigned to draw the maps to revise the maps, and then go back for a second time. And if it doesn't pass as a second time, then they try a third time. But the difference is, on the third time, the legislators can start offering amendments. You could literally offer an amendment that just replaces one set of maps for another. And so my concern is that third element. And so we're talking to legislators about fixing those things. Now, what I will say is, both the League of Women Voters is not endorsing either bill at the moment, nor is it opposing either bill.
Have they been through your meat grinder completely yet, or are you still analyzing them?
We're analyzing them, and we're waiting to see what else might be coming out, because we're hearing that, and they may not materialize, but we're hearing that there are at least two more bills that people are working on. But what I will say is, at the moment, these bills are better than what we have now.
Okay. Do you guys have a different and favorite or more recommended process that you would like to see rather than what's in either of these two bills?
Well, the official position of the League of Women Voters would be for an independent commission, and that the people who serve on a truly independent commission are not beholden to any particular party. That doesn't mean that they aren't affiliated with, a political party, but that they are not an elected official. There's certain positions that you can't run for, or your connections to politics. There are lots of restrictions on them, and that an independent commission would draw the map. I'm going to speak just as an individual here.
Yeah.
Not
I put up that
from
title, but I don't have it built. So
yeah, not from the League perspective, because again, we are not endorsing either bill at the moment. I don't know that we are going to. But if the clause were fixed in either of these bills on that third vote, I would personally feel more comfortable with them, because you at least have a different body drawing the maps, and both bills address criteria. And I have to say, no matter what route you go, criteria is critical. So you could have a so-called independent commission, but if they're using the wrong criteria, then you still get a gerrymander. So if they're allowed to use racial data, if they're allowed to use voter affiliation, all of that kind of data, when they initially draw a map, that could potentially be a problem. It's the ability to game the system that I am concerned about in the bills at the moment. So I suspect that there were some compromises made in being able to put the bill together.
If we did have an independent commission, would their decision still have to go to the legislature to be ratified?
If we had an independent commission, under our current system, what would have to happen is the legislature would have to pass legislation to have an independent commission, which is what one of these bills calls for. And then ultimately, the legislature would have to pass it. Now, different states have done it, differently in terms of what happens when a legislature doesn't pass on it. Our concern is we have had such bad actors here in this state when it comes to gerrymandering that quite frankly, the level of trust is very low, and that may be different than what's happened in some other states. Now, what I would add to that, though, is whatever system you use, including the current system, if you have no transparency in the process, you will continue to have a problem. So the maps that were drawn in 2011 were completely drawn behind closed doors. You can read about it if you want to learn about the Red Map project that I mentioned earlier that resulted in a lot of this, not just in North Carolina, but a lot of key states. There's an excellent book. I think it's the best book that's been written to understand what has happened and what its implications have been. It's by, the author is David Daley. The title of the book has, it's a profane title, so I'm going to refer to it as Rat Effed. That is the title of the book, Rat Effed.
On this program, we can push the explicit button.
Right, but I'm speaking on behalf of the League of Women Voters, so we're going to just refer to it as Rat Effed. And actually on our website, lwvwake.org, if you go into our advocacy page, you'll then find our redistricting page. We have a book discussion toolkit for any book group that would want to get together and read the book and then have a discussion about it. We have a whole guide. Yes, that's the book by David Daley.
Yep. It's 1526 in paperback from, where am I? Barnes & Noble. It's the first thing that came up.
And if you really want to understand redistricting, there's a whole chapter devoted just to North Carolina, and there are chapters devoted to other states that are worth reading to really understand that Red Map project and what happened. It is the book I would recommend.
Yeah. I think most of my knowledge from listening to the 538 series, the 538.com. They did a series on gerrymandering, and their coverage of North Carolina was back in the time when we were strictly looking at racial gerrymandering. So that's all they looked at here. But they also looked at a few states that had already started independent commissions.
Right.
And they were not hopeful. They said, well, the outcome is better, but it's still rat effed.
Well, and again, it depends on how the commission is constituted. And again, I would argue, what is the criteria? Are they bound by using a certain set of criteria? Things like making sure the district is compact, that it is contiguous, meaning a district that is strung out can't just be joined at a corner in order to make it one district. Those
like the fourth here is a big part of Western Wake County, a little bit of I-40,
right,
and then Chatham County.
Right, and some of it doesn't make sense unless you understand that a district is drawn to, pack a certain kind of voter into one district.
Yeah, which is how David Price won with 73%.
Right. But that was done in order to pack a different kind of voter into another district to guarantee the other party a win. And again, I'm an unaffiliated voter, and I don't want the deck stacked. I want a fair election and let the chips fall where they may in terms of which party is in power, as long as it is done fairly, because then you have the people speaking.
The powers that currently be and could shift back and forth absolutely don't want that.
No.
They are tooth and nail committed to maintaining their leverage.
Right. It worked for them, right? It's worked for them.
So they will fight. And in the stories of some of the states, I'm thinking about Arizona from the 538, they had the independent commission. It had an equal number of Republicans and Democrats and then one independent. But the screaming and yelling about who was who and what was what was unabated. It was like any political firestorm. No one sat back and said, this is nice and fair. This is great. Let's just do it this way. They still screamed and yelled.
And I don't know anything about what happened in that situation, except what I would say is if you were prohibited from using election data, all of a sudden redistricting, I understand, drawing the maps, becomes a much easier task when you're not trying to manipulate it for partisan advantage. So it is about the criteria. You know, many have said, well, computers can do this for you. Yeah, they can, but they can generate gerrymandered districts too, and a commission can too. It is about the criteria that is kind of fed into that system. Yeah. What criteria is required and what data is prohibited from being used. And I'm going to suggest to you that prohibited data is just as important as the criteria that must be used, because it's the prohibited data that is largely resulting in those partisan maps. Yeah. It's your election information.
This is deep in the weeds of how the sausage gets made. And you and I you can probably address it at a much deeper level than I can even comprehend it. But.
Well, I don't know about that. What I will tell you is this is a complicated issue, and I honestly 2 years ago I did not understand it near as well as I understood it today, and it took work to do it, and I still confuse it because it's so complex. And the lawsuits are even more confusing because there have been so many, and trying to keep straight which lawsuit is which, because we have lawsuits that have been in play for years. We have had lawsuits that have just been about congressional districts, which is what the current lawsuit that was in the Supreme Court was about. Those are our districts that send our representatives and senators, our representatives to the U.S. Congress. We've had lawsuits that were different, that were about legislative districts. Those districts are, those are the districts that determine who goes to the state legislature. Yeah. And then we've had lawsuits about, municipal ones.
They've been equally gerrymandered.
They've been equally gerrymandered, but that was the tactic. Yeah. That was the tactic to ultimately gerrymander Congress because, you have to start at the state level.
Because when we were talking about practically 50-50 statewide voting, yielding 10 Democrats and 3 Republicans, for our U.S. representatives, a similar thing happened for the state legislature, the representatives and senators for the state, still about 50-50. And even with the big blue wave that came through.
Right. So let's look at what happened in 2012, which I think is most telling. In 2010, the GOP came in, fair and square. 2010, we had a census. So 2011, we had to go through redistricting. That's the normal process.
So 2010, the Republicans won in democratically gerrymandered maps.
Yeah, but not by huge margins.
Yeah, and not very well gerrymandered.
So with those new maps, what happened in 2012? The GOP won 9 of 13 congressional seats, even though Democrats cast more votes statewide. Now that makes no sense, right? And we know from Lewis's statements, and that was part of what the Supreme Court argument was about, that Lewis in the legislature did that intentionally. And then the GOP got a little over half the votes at the state level in 2012, just a little over half the votes. So like you said, almost even. but they secured 2/3 of the seats in the General Assembly. So that's how they got that supermajority. And why is a supermajority relevant? That means they're veto proof. The governor had no power. And we saw that impacted not just the current Democratic governor, but impacted the previous Republican governor.
Corey didn't have a lot of fans in the legislature.
And they didn't have to work with him.
Yeah.
It just didn't matter because they were veto proof. So they weren't working with the governor really from their own party, and they're certainly not really working with the governor from the opposite party. Now, we had what many have referred to as a blue wave this last election that broke the supermajority, but we're not at that balance that statistically it might suggest. And some have said, well, see, gerrymandering's not harmful because you really can, you can overcome it. And that's not really fair, because in order for that to happen, the percentage of people you have to turn out in your particular party to overcome it is so much greater than what the other party has to do. It really simply is not fair, and the odds are still so against you that you can still consider those seats relatively safe. Yeah.
It looked like, I referred to it as a blue lawn sprinkler in North Carolina, but it wasn't. It was a massive wave that just hit a breakwater of gerrymandering.
Mm-hmm. It did.
And got dispersed.
Right. And so what do we need voters to do? Because ultimately voters need to care enough to change this. They need to start making it a voting issue. Don't vote for candidates who don't support redistricting reform. And that may even mean more to your down ballot candidates who often rise to becoming those legislative candidates. And by the way, redistricting is done at a local level in many municipalities. And so you may want to find, the League of Women Voters of Wake County has a project where we're now working at the municipal level to identify who's broken down into districts, who might divide into districts, and which ones we're going to focus on to make sure it's nonpartisan. But find out if your municipality elects people by districts, because your local county commission, your local town council, it can also be gerrymandered. School boards can be gerrymandered. So you want to be asking those questions of candidates at all levels, and then you need to vote that way. And in the meantime, you need to call or email your elected official. Even if you think you're going to hit a brick wall, they do tally that feedback. They do need to know how many people are for or against a particular issue, whether it's gerrymandering or something else. So it does no harm, and it may in fact do good to apply more and more pressure as a constituent. Takes you just 30 seconds to place a phone call or send an email.
And I think because so relatively few people do that, each person who does it, that opinion carries way more weight than you'd think as just one person.
Yeah, I agree. And once upon a time, at least in Congress, some people theorized for every person who would call or write in, it represented X number of people. Now, I don't know if they still have a calculation like that these days, but it does matter. It absolutely matters.
But if you're from one party and someone calls with an opinion from the other party, it doesn't matter at all.
And it may matter less to them, but you're still a voter. So I'd keep calling in. And quite frankly, if you have a representative or senator in the legislature that you're happy with, you voted for them, and they're in a safe district, you still need to be calling into them and telling them you want redistricting reform. You don't want so-called safe districts.
All right. One place we can find out a lot about this as we head into the next election is your website, the 411 Project.
Well, actually, for redistricting, you want to go to the League of Women Voters of Wake County, which is lwvwake.org. And if you go to our advocacy menu, you'll then find a redistricting page. Okay. And what you'll find in it as you scroll through are lots of resources where we've put documents in PDF form Most of them are very short. We try to keep them most of them to 1 or 2 pages. They're written for the lay person. So if you're just wanting to learn about it, this is a good place to start learning. If you're wanting some basic facts about it, you can get it in an easy to read form.
And down here at the bottom, things to actually do.
Exactly.
What to go ahead and do. We made it to that 2-hour pointer just about.
Yes.
Pretty impressive.
Yeah.
WUNC would never do this.
No,
WRAL would never do this.
I would be edited way down.
Yep. So, yay for podcasting. Thank you, Diane. I really appreciate
Thank
you
you for having me.
All right. That will be it for this episode of the Triangle Talk Show. It was 55, Politics, the League of Extraordinary Women Voters. You know, by the way, I was thinking I was pretty clever in thinking about that. And then I realized I can't be the only one who's ever come up with that idea. You've probably heard it before.
I don't know that I have. I've referred to them as extraordinary or exceptional because my members just never fail to impress me with both their skill and their devotion to our mission.
Well, I did a little Googling because I said, I can't be the only one who thought about it. And sure enough, I found a bunch of articles. Here's one from Chicago Sun-Times. The League of Extraordinary Women, they left off the voters part, but it's about the League of Women Voters up in Illinois. So, yeah, I'm not the only one who came up with that.
I still think you're clever.
You are Diana Wynn, and currently communications coordinator. Ashley Popio said it had a bunch of other things that you've been in. And you've been in the ACLU, and so you've been a busy woman.
I have,
and
yes.
And you'll be the president of the Wake County chapter. Are you ever going to go for a state, national? Do you have aspirations?
I am busy. No, I have no aspirations. I am busy just trying to, stay abreast of everything that we are working on at the moment.
Spoken like a politician. I'm happy with my job. I'm not running for president. All right. I am Gary Pierce. That is it for this episode. Thank you for watching, listening, or whatever you've done to absorb this. Our website will have some of the links to some of these things that we've talked about, triangletalkshow.com. And I'm out of here. Over and out.